Hello, welcome ladies and gentlemen to today's tutorial. Today we continue our journey with the blood supply of the head and neck areas. Now in our last discussion we got to know that yes, the main elastic artery which is going to supply the head and neck areas will be the common carotid arteries. Now what we saw is that yes, as the superior border of the thyroid cartilage, the common carotid artery actually divided into what we call internal carotid artery and of course external carotid artery. Now what we find is that yes, this external carotid artery will actually supply areas which are external to what we call the cranial cavity. So the superficial areas, yes, the skin, the muscles, yes, the epicranial aponeurosis, gallia aponeurotica, yes, the head and neck area superficial or external to what we call the cranial cavity will be supplied by what we call the external carotid artery. Now for the internal, it's going to actually supply areas which are inside the cranial cavity. But apart from yes, the external carotid artery actually giving supply to the external surfaces, yes, which we find it external to what we call the cranial cavity. One of the divisions of the external carotid artery being actually the maxillary artery will actually give a deep branch which we call it the middle meningeal artery. This middle meningeal artery will actually supply what we call the dura mater, which is the Pachy meninges. Where we find covering the brain. So that's where the exception actually comes in. So with the external carotid artery, to make things easier for easier descriptive purposes, we actually divide the branches into actual anterior branches, posterior branches, medial branch, and of course the terminal branches which actually end the branches of the external carotid artery. So in all, the external carotid artery actually have 7 branches. 7 main branches will be actually coming directly from the external carotid artery, which we are going to look at. And we actually help us to learn these things with actually a mnemonic, which I've composed. For us to actually help us to remember these kind of branches. So without much ado, let's look at the course. Let's look at some relations. And of course, if there is any clinical application to this structure, which is the external carotid artery. So here we are. This is the H of aorta. So the aortic arch actually will be here, where you have the subclavian artery. This is actually the left subclavian. Then we actually have the left common carotid artery. So that at the superior border, yes, there's a thyroid cartilage of the larynx. At the superior border of the thyroid cartilage, then we are going to have division. Okay, so it's going to branch, give us 2 branches. One which goes posteriorly, which we call it the internal carotid artery, and then we also have the one which runs anteriorly, being the external carotid artery. So it means that the external carotid artery will actually arise from the upper border of the thyroid cartilage as division of what we call as one of the terminal branches of the common carotid artery. So it runs and then comes all the way, eventually running posterior to what we call the neck. This is the neck of what we call the thyroid of the mandible, which is actually part of the the ramus, actually part of the condyle, also the condyle of the mandible, mandibular condyle. Okay, running posterior to the neck of what we call the ramus, the neck of the ramus of the mandible. Now one thing is that, so it tells us that it's going to actually run all the way in the neck area, actually in the carotid triangle. So if you have not visited the video on the carotid triangle, please do so, the carotid triangle, and then it will ascend all the way to come here to come actually supply the head area. So from the neck it will ascend to actually supply the neck area. Now one thing that we find is that when it gets to the neck area, okay, the neck of the mandible is able to divide to give it terminal branches, which we are going to see, and these terminal branches will be what we call the superficial temporal artery, and of course there will be another branch over here being the maxillary artery. So at the level of the neck, it's able to divide into what we call these terminal branches, the superficial temporal, and of course the maxillary, artery. Because of course this is the maxilla, so if it is branching around that area, we will call it the maxillary artery, and this is the temporal area, so we have the temporal, superficial temporal artery actually. Now one thing is that yes, even in this area where it is dividing, okay, it is actually dividing in the substance of the thyroid gland. It is actually dividing. These terminal divisions are actually happening within the substance of the thyroid gland. Okay, so that is one thing that we are going to actually find. Then of course yes, in its ascent, it will continue to of course ascend, but this time around it will run actually posterior to what we call the posterior belly of this is the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. This is the anterior belly. So if you have not visited the triangles of the neck, please do so that you get more insight in this. This is the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. So it will ascend deep to it, okay, will go deep to it, and then of course it will actually be between actually the stylohyoid muscle as well. Yes, that's what we are going to find. So that is that point where as it ascends, okay, it will run deep to what we call the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, and then eventually will run into what we call the thyroid gland. Okay, so when it enters the thyroid gland, that is where it's able to give its terminal branches. It's able to give its terminal branches, and we said that its terminal branches will actually be of course the maxillary artery, and of course the superficial temporal artery. So that is how it's going to actually run by way of its course. So all the way from the superior border of the thyroid cartilage ascends, and then this time around comes posterior to the neck of the ramus of the mandible. But actually as it runs, it will actually run also posterior to the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, okay, and then it will actually enter what we call the substance of the thyroid gland, where it will divide to give off its terminal branches. So this one will tell us the course of this the external carotid artery. Therefore, for the relations, we look at relations which are going to be within this triangle, which we call a carotid triangle. So there will be superficial relations. For the superficial relations, and of course we also have what we call deep relations. So for the superficial relations in the carotid triangle, we are going to have what we call the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay, this big muscle will be superficial to what we call the external carotid artery. So sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay, apart from that, yes, there's going to be relation to what we call the cranial nerve 12. That's the hypoglossal nerve, who also be related to it. Okay, superficially. Apart from that, we also look at the common facial vein. Common facial vein will also relate to it anteriorly. Then apart from this, lingual vein will also be there, okay, which you don't see them here, but they will be related to it actually, yes, superficially in the carotid triangle actually. Then apart from that, yes, of course, the posterior belly of the digastric muscle will be related to it actually superficially. Then apart from this, also talk about the stylohyoid muscle. Okay, so this is the stylohyoid muscle, which runs anterior to what we call the posterior belly of the omohyoid muscle. Okay, so this is the stylohyoid muscle, and this is the posterior belly of the omohyoid, of the digastric muscle. So that's what we are going to find. But again, in the substance of the parotid gland, it will also be related to what we call the retromandibular vein superficially. This retromandibular vein can also be called posterior facial vein, and to actually be formed by what we call the superficial temporal vein, and of course the maxillary vein. So that is one thing that we are going to see. Now this retromandibular, the word is retro. So retro means behind. Okay, it will run in the parotid gland. Actually, it will run posterior to the mandibular ramus. So the ramus of the mandible. Okay, this is the ramus of the mandible. Running posterior to it will be the retro. So retro means behind. Retromandibular, vein, or the deep, facial vein, or actually the posterior facial vein actually. So that's what we are going to find. Then, of course, apart from this, the facial nerve, which is cranial nerve 7, will also be related to it in, the area where we have the parotid, gland. So these are the superficial relations. Now, for the deep relations, again, we can see that. But for the deep relations, we are going to have what we call the constrictors. Okay, so that means we are going to have the superior, middle, and of course inferior constrictor, muscles also relating to it. Actually, deep. It will be deep structures. And apart from this, we're also going to have what we call the internal, laryngeal nerve. Apart from that, we are going to have also the internal, carotid, artery. So here we are. This is the external, so deep to it, okay, deep to it, we are also going to have the internal carotid, artery also relating to it, posterior. Now, one thing is that how do we, differentiate between these ones? Now, of course, this one is running posteriorly, this one is running anteriorly, but there will be some structures, which will actually separate these two, divisions of what we call the common carotid artery. So what are the structures which are going to be found between, the external carotid artery and the internal carotid arteries? So these structures will actually be what we call the styloid process. So we have the styloid process. The styloid process will be somewhere here. Okay, styloid process will be somewhere. So it's finding itself between these two, divisions of the common carotid artery. Yes, apart from that, yes, we're also going to have what we call stylopharyngeus muscle, which you can find here. Stylopharyngeus muscle will also be there. Yes, apart from this, we are also going to have what we call the styloglossus muscle. Okay, styloglossus muscle will also be there. Then, of course, anything that has to do with the styloid, these muscles, styloid process, and the muscles which are related to the styloid process will actually be related in between these divisions of the common carotid artery. So we are going to have also the styloglossus muscle, as I said, stylopharyngeus, the styloid process itself. Then of course we're also going to have what we call the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal nerve will also be there. Then apart from that, the pharyngeal division or pharyngeal branch of the vagus nerve, that's cranial nerve 10, will also be related there. So these are some relations that we are going to find here. So let's look at actually the divisions of the external carotid artery, which is of importance to this discussion. We are going to have what we call the medial branch. The medial, there's only one medial branch, being the ascending pharyngeal artery, but our ascending pharyngeal artery, we don't find it here. Okay, so that one will be medial. Okay, so we don't see it here. So the ascending pharyngeal artery, yes, it's out of sight here. All right, so we're going to supply some areas in the pharynx, so ascending pharyngeal artery to ascend to a supply, but it will be medial, but we don't find it here. There's a lateral aspect, so medial will be deep to this area. So then we look at the anterior branches. Now we have 3 anterior branches. Now we said that there's only one medial branch, being the ascending pharyngeal artery. There are 3 anterior branches, and these anterior branches are this one which runs here. Okay, so running anteriorly, we have what you call the facial artery. Facial artery. So we're going to give other branches to supply, the face. So this is the facial artery. So you can see that the facial artery always will run, beneath what we call the body of the mandible. So it will run beneath the body of the mandible. Therefore, you can feel the pulsations of the facial artery here. Okay, so when you touch this area of your mandible, then you can feel the pulsations of the facial artery. Yes, apart from this facial artery, we are also going to have this artery, which we find here. Okay, just below the facial artery, we have this artery, being the lingual artery. Okay, so being the lingual artery. So there is another artery over here, being the lingual artery. Okay, so this is the lingual artery. So below the facial artery, we are going to have the lingual artery. Then apart from that, yes, when you look at this one, okay, below what we call the lingual artery, we are also going to have what we call the superior thyroid artery. Running superior, there's a thyroid gland, so you can say superior thyroid artery. Superior thyroid artery. Now, if you see this branch over here, this is actually coming from the superior thyroid artery, which we call it the superior laryngeal artery. So superior laryngeal artery is going to supply the muscles of the larynx, so superior laryngeal artery over here. But this is actually the main branch that we are interested in. That is what we call the the superior thyroid artery. So that's one thing that we have. So there are three divisions or branches of which we get from the anterior branch, okay, which are what we call, so from superior to inferior, we have the facial artery, we have what we call the we have the lingual artery, then we have what we call the superior thyroid artery, and the superior thyroid artery is given this branch that you see here, being actually the superior laryngeal artery. So that's one thing that we find with this. Now the next one is going to be the posterior branches. Now there are two posterior branches that we find, and for the posterior branches, we can appreciate them here. Okay, one of them could be appreciated here. So relating to the ear, so anything that relates to the ear is as auricle, So we have running posterior to actually the ear lobe, actually the external acoustic meatus will be with the posterior auricular artery, Then apart from this, yes, we're also going to have what we call the occipital artery, which we don't appreciate it from this area, but of course from here, yes, there is still a branch coming from the posterior auricular artery. Then of course this is the occipital artery. So that's one thing. So depend on the name, it tells you where it's going to supply. So the occipital one is going to supply the occipital area, yes, of the scalp, essentially. So that's one thing that we find. And then now, so having seen these two, then the last division will be the terminal divisions. Okay, so terminal, we saw medial division, we saw anterior division, we've seen posterior division. The next one is terminal. So terminally, at the end, is going to give us two divisions. And we said that division is going to occur in the substance of the parotid gland. And these divisions, are this one that we find here being the superficial temporal, so around the temporal area. Okay, that's where it's going to supply. So give off these branches to supply the temporal area, so being the superficial temporal artery. Then apart from that, we're also going to have another division which will actually come, this division that you find here, where it's actually giving off this branch around the deep to the ramus of the mandible, being what we call the ramus of the mandible, but actually will give supply the maxillary area. So that branch is known as maxillary branch of the terminal branch. So this is the maxillary, okay, so the maxillary artery that you find here, okay, maxillary artery. All right, so these are actually the divisions that we find with branches that we are going to find with the external carotid artery, which you actually have to know that we have the medial division being the ascending pharyngeal, we have the anterior division being actually the facial, from superior to inferior, facial, lingual, so facial, talk about facial, then lingual, then of course superior thyroid. Okay, then of course the posterior divisions, there are two. We talk about the posterior auricular, okay, which you can see here, and then of course occipital. All right, so then apart from this, we are having the terminal branches, which are two, and these terminal branches will happen in the substance of the parotid gland. And these ones will be the superficial temporal, and then of course we also have what we call the maxillary artery. Now this maxillary artery, we said that all these branches are actually going to supply superficial areas of the head and neck area, but surprisingly maxillary artery is given another branch, which we call it the middle meningeal artery. So you can see how the middle meningeal artery, okay, so this represents the groove for the middle meningeal artery, so actually going to supply the dura mater. So we said that actually if there's a groove over here, then there could be laceration of the middle meningeal artery, which could result in that kind of intracranial bleeding. Then of course, if it's so extreme, then there should be a hole made here so that we can, through actually the pterium, the weakest point of the brain, to actually enter and then of course ligate this middle meningeal artery. Now, in effect, one thing that we are going to say is that we can have a mnemonic to actually summarize all these branches of the external carotid artery, being what we call she always likes friends over papa, mama, and sister. So with this simple mnemonic, we should be able to remember these kind of branches. So she, will be actually the, superior, laryngeal. She will actually be, the superior thyroid artery, actually. So the superior thyroid artery is she. Then always, for the ascending, pharyngeal artery, which we said is the medial branch, which you can see here. Then, likes will be the lingual, okay, which you can see here. This is the lingual artery. Then, friends, will be the facial artery, which you can find here. Then, over will be the occipital, which you can see here. Then, of course, over, occipital is over. Then papa, that's the posterior auricular. Okay, so posterior auricular is papa. Okay, then mama is going to be maxillary, which of course you can see here. Mama is maxillary. Okay, so this is a maxillary artery. So mama. Then of course, sister. So sister is actually going to be what we call the superficial temporal artery. Superficial temporal artery, which you can find here, which is going to supply this area. So superficial temporal artery. So with this mnemonic, she always likes friends over papa, mama, and sister. We should be able to, remember, the branches of the common carotid artery. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is what I have for you. Well, for the internal carotid artery, yes, because it's going to supply structures which are, within the cranial cavity. What will happen is that we will actually consider it when we look at, blood supply to the brain, in our later sections. So, thank you very much for your audience.